I'd talk a little bit about Darwin to begin with and my relationship to him. Then Emma will talk a bit about Virginia Woolf and her relationship to her. And we will explore perhaps what it means to have the name or the mantle of somebody so different from oneself, from such another age, and in my case, a scientist, in Emma's case, a writer. So I thought I'd start by introducing Charles Darwin and my relationship to him. He was the grandfather of my grandmother. I was very close to my grandmother. She was called Nora Darwin and then Nora Barlow. And she was the first editor of Charles Darwin. There's a nice story that she found all the manuscripts. At some funeral, somebody was given a whole lot of manuscripts and drove off in the car, the open car, and the papers fell out as the car went. And she went and drove along behind, taking them out of the hedges. But anyway, she worked on them. She edited his diary. She edited his journal of the voyage of the Beagle. And she put all these papers into the university library in Cambridge. And I was very close to her. And eventually I wrote a book which is about Charles's life, his boyhood, his young manhood, his marriage, and his thought. And I thought I'd start by reading you a poem from a bit of his diary. When he was a young man, he had discovered, or he had realized that how evolution worked. He was 29, and he had realized by himself, by his work, that evolution must work through sexual selection. And he then thought he ought to do a bit of sexual selection himself. And he wrote this in his journal, in his notebook. And I'm going to stand up for it. He called this poem, I've called this poem The Balance Sheet, but they are all his words. Against freedom to go where I please, conversation of clever men in clubs, choice of society and plenty of it, no one to interfere with solitude I need, not forced to visit relatives or bend in every trifle. Whoever she is might hate London. Children are anxiety, responsibility, expense, not so much money for books. There could be misrule in the house, quarreling even, banished the country, becoming fat, indolent, fool. I should never know French, see America, go up in a balloon, but no children, no second life, no one to care about me in old age. Why continue working all day with no sympathy from near and dear? But who? Who could it be? 4, a constant companion, a friend in old age, an object to be loved and played with, better than dog. Children, if it please God, a home and someone to care for it. Female chat, good for one's health. Charm of music, perhaps. Terrible loss of my time. But my God, picture a whole life spent like a neuter bee, working in smoke and grime of a London house all day alone. Then think of a nice, soft wife on a sofa, looking at me with a good fire and books. Look at dingy Great Marlborough Street. Marry, 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 QED. So he went off and proposed to his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, whom he'd known all his life. And it was a very good marriage. And they both had the same sense of humor. You can hear in that little exercise when he says better than dog, he's almost laughing at himself. And if it wasn't for their marriage, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. So that's a little bit about Darwin and my grandmother. And here is Emma, who is the great niece, as we would say in English, or grandniece, you would say here, of Virginia Woolf.
Hello, lovely to be here. So as Ruth explained her relationship to Charles Darwin, I'm Virginia's great niece, so she's my father's aunt. My father, who lives in London and is nearly 90 now, was very close to Virginia until her death as a young man, and extremely close to Leonard, my great-uncle. He lived in Leonard Woolf's home. By the way, I do recommend Leonard Woolf as a wonderful writer, and not nearly as well known as Virginia. My father lived in Leonard's London home in Victoria Square for 30 years, along with various of the Bloomsbury group, various artists. My father used to go and rescue beautiful drawings from the bins where Duncan Grant would have thrown a sketch or Vanessa Bell would have cast off one of her paintings because they thought they were no good. It's lovely to hear Ruth reading the poem about Darwin making that choice, because the man-woman theme, but also the to have or not to have children, is extremely relevant in Virginia Woolf's life. She's known as someone who was mad, cold, slightly bitchy, slightly snobbish, but actually she wasn't like that at all. My father talks about her as a lovely woman, very, very warm, very maternal, and in her diaries and in her letters, she writes about how she longed for children. She and Leonard longed for children, and it didn't happen, partly because of her repeated breakdowns. So that's a little bit about Virginia. Obviously, I didn't know her. I've been asked many times, is she your mum? Which would make me 75 at least. So she's not my mum, she's not my aunt, she's my great aunt. So there we go.
So I thought I'd pick up the man-woman theme by saying a little bit about their marriage, Charles and Emma's marriage. When he proposed to her, she was surprised. She was one of many daughters of Josiah Wedgwood, not the famous potter, but the son of the famous potter. And her youngest sister, whom she was very close to, Fanny, had died 7 years ago. And she was looking after her mother, who had dementia, and she thought she was on the shelf. And then one Sunday morning, her cousin, Charles, came up. They lived in the north of England, came up on a train, stayed the night, as he had all her life. And he proposed marriage to her. And she was very surprised. She said, I didn't think he cared. And he said he was very nervous. He thought he was too ugly. So altogether, here were two people who had a lot of wonderful thoughts, education, ideas, but were really quite shy in their own identities. And then came the question of religion. And you cut. Okay. So you don't need this. Okay. All right. Have you managed to hear anything so far? No. Okay. I'm going to start. I'm going to give up about the first bit. I'm going to read you the letter that Emma, that's Charles's cousin, wrote. After she'd accepted marriage from him, she was a bit worried about religion. By now, what had happened in his mind, he was 29, and he had realized that he did not understand, he did not believe all that the Bible, that the Christian Bible said. And at that point in Victorian Christianity, if you didn't believe absolutely everything, you would go to hell. Can you hear me now? Okay. And this was a real problem in Victorian marriages. Here we are in the 1830s. And are you okay? Do you want to say something? No. Okay. That it was a problem. Geology meant that a lot of Victorian men were beginning to disbelieve the story of the flood and various other stories in the Bible, and particularly, of course, creation. It didn't mean that they disbelieved the Christian ethic and the morals that went along with both bits of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, but they didn't believe those bits. The women were not necessarily reading the new science that was coming out, and they were scared. They believed in love that was forever. They believed they would go to heaven if they believed all the Bible. But their husbands wouldn't. If they didn't believe all the Bible, they would go to hell. So this is the letter that Emma wrote to him after they were engaged. Just
It's really clear now. Is it clear? Yeah, much clearer, much better.
It booms back.
I know.
Aha. Okay, I'm going to take this thing off of you as well. Can you? Okay, I think we're in business. So this is a really sweet letter, and a really direct letter. And I think you can hear the kind of trust between this man and woman that was built up through the marriage. Actually, no, this is a letter that she wrote when she was pregnant, when they got married and she was pregnant. And so she might die. She might die in childbirth, because people were dying in childbirth all the time. And so if she went to heaven and he went to hell, she wouldn't be with him again. And that was a real, I know that sounds funny, but it was a really agonizing thing for a lot of middle-class Victorian women. She writes him a note about salvation. When I talk to you face to face, I cannot say exactly what I wish. Her back aches all the time. She never goes out. His friend's wife has died in childbirth. You say you are uncertain about Christian revelation, but your opinion is still not formed. He's told her his discoveries. She'd love him to be right in everything. She's very afraid he is not. Faith is beyond our comprehension, not provable in the scientific way you like. I believe you sincerely wish to know the truth, but there are dangers in giving up revelation and Christ's offer of eternal life, and in the sin. I know you will have patience with your own dear wife, of ingratitude for Christ's suffering, casting off what has been done for you, for everyone. My fear is for the afterlife. I cannot say how happy you make me in this one, nor how dearly I love you. I thank you for all the affection, which makes my happiness more and more each day. But everything that concerns you concerns me. I should be most unhappy if I thought we would not belong to each other for eternity. He kept her note all his life. He must have said something then, but he wrote to her too, on the outer fold. No one knows when. He was maybe quite old. He wasn't blind to where his thought led, what she thought she'd lose. When I am dead, no, I have kissed and cried over this many times. So that letter, which she wrote to him in 1839, she found among his things when he died in 1882. And he'd just written that little note on the outside, when I'm dead, no, I have kissed and cried over this many times. So that worry about Christianity was at the heart of their marriage, but it was constantly negotiated between them, because of course it was implicit in his writings too. And they just held this sense of their difference between them. So I think that I'm very lucky that when I was working on this and in the family, that I was descended from people who acknowledged agreement, acknowledged difference, and agreed to differ. Now, do you want to come up and talk about it? Have you got one? It's not on. I think
Is this on? Yes, this is fine. Ruth, can I just check? Did Charles Darwin die in 1882? Well, there's a lovely symmetry for you, because Virginia Woolf was born in 1882, and I didn't know that, but I mean, we've overlapped as if we'd planned it, which we hadn't. Just hearing Ruth talking there about the closeness and the intimacy, even 100, 150 years ago, reminds me so much of Virginia and Leonard, and the openness and the intimacy between them that even now some people don't have in marriages. You know, to think of young people in their 20s and early 30s marrying and sort of negotiating their way through the physical side of the relationship, the things like childbirth and the very real risk of dying. It's really touching. It reminds me a little bit, if I may, I'm going to read you something that Virginia wrote to Leonard Woolf before she accepted his proposal. So 104 years ago, 1912, Leonard was proposing to Virginia. He had come back from being a colonial governor in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and had decided to propose to her. And he proposed a few times in 1912. And she hesitated and wasn't quite sure, and she was about to turn 30 and was having one of those sort of crises about, am I a writer, am I a failure, what am I going to do with my life, I'm not married, I don't have children. And when Virginia writes to Leonard, they were both in London, but when she writes to Leonard, she writes with such honesty about her feelings and about her lack of physical attraction to him, which is, I think, is hurtful, but it's also kind of admirable in a way. So while she was hesitating throughout the spring of 1912, she struggled to reconcile being half in love with him with a sort of revulsion over what she called the sexual side of it. Writing to him a few weeks before they became engaged, she explained what was holding her back. They'd gone for a long walk across the downs. They were great walkers and talkers and readers and writers. And so they'd gone for a long walk. And she says, "As I told you brutally the other day, I feel no attraction in you. There are moments, when you kissed me the other day was one, when I feel no more than a rock." It's pretty galling to say that to a young man who's kissed you in passion. I feel no more than a rock. And I think she was hesitating. If you read her diary at the time, I think she was hesitating not because she didn't feel anything for Leonard, but because she hoped for so much, because she wanted so much. She says, on accepting his proposal, she says, "We both of us want a marriage that is a tremendous living thing, always alive, always hot, not dead and easy in parts, as most marriages are. We ask a great deal of life, don't we? So she's saying that in 1912, and she's really thinking about the kind of marriage that they'll have, that they'll want. And this is what makes me sad, as someone who's talked to my father a lot about Virginia, is that she is so often portrayed as a lesbian, frigid, unfaithful, unmaternal, cold, suicidal, mad, all of that stuff that isn't Virginia at all. And in actual fact, she and Leonard had a wonderful marriage, a really fruitful creative partnership. And of course, if it wasn't for Leonard keeping her alive he stopped her from suicide many times. But if it wasn't for Leonard keeping her alive throughout the 20s and 30s, we would never have had To the Lighthouse. We would never have had Mrs. Dalloway, The Waves, The Years, Between the Acts, any of that. She did eventually commit suicide in 1941, 75 years ago. But Leonard kept her alive for decades. So it's to me, it's a marriage a little bit like Charles and Emma that really, you could see the closeness between them and that really fed off each other.
So that's wonderful. I didn't know that. So I'm going to go forward now to when The Origin of Species was published. Okay, technologically challenged here. Charles realized the importance of his ideas very early, as I said, when he was 29. But he was a scientist and he believed in evidence. You couldn't just have the leap of idea. You had to have the solid evidence to support the theory. And he really spent, from 1836 to 37, when he understood what he was doing, until 1859, so it's over 20 years, when The Origin of Species came out. Because he also knew, he'd studied theology at Cambridge, he knew what he was up against in the society. In fact, people were much more theologically sophisticated anyway in the Christian church than they are today. So that the future Archbishop of Canterbury read The Origin of Species and said, well, I see now, it's simple. Rather than making the world, God made the world make itself. So the science which Darwin had laid bare was just putting everything one step further back, and that's no problem. And whereas the creationists now are very much more theologically shallow, and they don't sort of understand. But anyway, it was a problem. And so this poem is called The Open Window, and it's imagining, it's taking words of his, and yes, of his and of the society, and putting it in a moment when Emma is tackling the fact that The Origin of Species has been published. And I've prefaced it with something from one of his letters in 1860, in which he says, and this is very much the theme of this festival, I think, there is no greater mystery in the whole world, as it seems to me, than the existence of sexes. The open window. He is glad that she is glad. He has not publicly rejected a creator, and he hardly mentioned man. Psychology will now be based on a new foundation, the acquirement of each necessary power, capacity by gradation. That was all. The soon-to-be Archbishop of Canterbury explains you can, indeed, square evolution with a God. God operates through the slow work of natural cause. He gets a fan letter from Charles Kingsley, novelist. Even better than making the world, God makes the world make itself. He watches her smile at Lenny and open a window for fresh air. Religion, the burned heart in its thorns, a rock face shot with quartz, on which the sun shines as it rises, lighting the rock to fire. But he was very affected by the attacks that happened, the cartoons showing him as a monkey with the sort of arguments from the church. And he became quite ill. He'd been ill ever since he'd come back from the Beagle voyage to South America. Possibly he got bitten by an insect with something called Chagas disease, which stays in your blood for life. But the decade after publishing The Origin of Species, he was particularly ill. He vomited every morning. He was awaking and with sweats and crying at night. And Emma looked after him. His supporters sharpened their swords for argument. He's ill. They debate at Oxford. He takes a hydropathic cure. Only Emma knows what the nights are like. Hysterical weeping, retching, smells, days of giddiness and collapse. Bessie, that's one of their children, they had 10 children. Bessie fails with a regular pulse and a nervous tic. George has a fever. Lenny, many bad days. Etty keeps very weak. A strange inheritance. My accursed constitution shows itself in ever a new form. Don't fathers who feel wrong in themselves locate it in their children? Touched by the sweetness and gentleness with which he endured, this is Emma's voice, I cannot recall any case in which pain was so truly poignant. When the worst attacks come on, he seems almost crushed with agony, but they are so stoically borne. Lunatic farting, vomit, stomach and whole body ache, midnight demons, weeping, shakes. They must have organic origin, like everything. Tears streak graying stubble on his cheeks. I am never comfortable without you. She cannot leave him, day or night, for more than a quarter of an hour. I don't want to go on because I want to hear much more about Virginia.
Well, I'm going to once again pick up on something Ruth's been touching on, which is that theme of illness, which runs through maybe the writer's life, the creative life, and again, Virginia and Leonard. So much of what you've read reminds me of Leonard and how he, as I've said, kept Virginia alive. She wrote to a friend in the late 1930s, if it wasn't for Leonard, I would have shot myself long ago. He rescued her from jumping out of a window. He rescued her from overdoses. There were many, many attempts. And according to my father, Leonard actually gave up a lot of his own life, his political work. He was a Fabian, and his own writings were sacrificed to Virginia as the kind of, and I wonder if it's the same with Charles and Emma. Obviously, it's different because she's a woman and wouldn't have been expected to have a career of her own. But it sounds as though she devoted herself to the genius.
Completely, yes. Yes, completely. Also, their children. I mean, they had 10 children. The oldest girl, who was the second child, died tragically when she was 10 of something that was probably tuberculosis, but it could have been anything. But it was quite long drawn out. It was very painful. And Charles felt guilty because his theories were already evolving, and he realized that he'd married his first cousin, and so inbreeding might mean that his little girl had inherited something from him. As I said, he was often ill. So when she finally died, that was the moment in their marriage which was the most painful, because Emma tucked everything into a little box that reminded her of her daughter and thanked God that her child didn't suffer too much and was not suffering now. While Charles felt this was that nature was cruel, that nature was not beneficent, and he didn't know about genes, but he would have, genes were what he was thinking about, we would say now, that it was the weakest go to the wall. He never used the phrase survival of the fittest, but that was what he was thinking about. So, but apart from that, they had these other children. One other little girl died, and then the youngest child, who was a Down syndrome baby, he died of measles when he was about 18 months. But they had lots of other children, so she was looking after a huge house and garden and 7 children, and this ill man all the time. Yeah.
There are so many more interesting parallels there. I mean, obviously, Virginia and Leonard, as I've said, didn't have children, and Virginia, it was sort of decided for her. It was decided, her sister, the artist Vanessa Bell, wrote rather interferingly to Leonard and to Virginia's doctors that, she's really not strong enough to have a baby and all of this stuff. And Virginia felt infantilized by this. She felt that decisions were being taken out of her hands. She was sent off to rest homes in Twickenham, near where they lived in Richmond. And she was fed up. They would feed her up to a certain weight, and they insisted on total rest, bed rest, no writing for a writer like Virginia, no visitors. And in a funny way, in slightly the same way that Charles and Emma took their separate pains and different feelings about the death of their daughter, Virginia blamed herself for becoming ill, for being mad, and Leonard didn't know what he was doing wrong. And then she became violent towards, in one of her worst breakdowns in 1915, it was Leonard that she was violent towards. She was violently hostile towards him. And she couldn't see him. He wasn't allowed to go and see her. And it seemed so strange that the man that was really her, keeping her alive, and the people that loved each other most, and they did. I just want to read you a couple of lines from her suicide note, which to me is so moving. Her suicide note to Leonard, she wrote it, she left it on the hall table, and she walked down to the River Ouse in Sussex, in their Sussex home. She left a note for Leonard and a note for her sister Vanessa. And in it, she says to Leonard, "What I want to say is I owe all the happiness of my life to you. You have been entirely patient with me and incredibly good. I don't think 2 people could have been happier than we have been." And that's not just a suicide note, it's a love letter as well to Leonard. And my dad remembers that day when Leonard was leaving the British Library and running for the bus, and he just saw Leonard running away down the Euston Road. And the whole time was nightmarish. They didn't find Virginia Woolf's body until about 3 weeks later, and it was in the news and it was in the papers. But the closeness and the way that illness draws people together, and it's really interesting parallels. I'll hand back to Ruth.
Well, the last poem I'll read is really about his death and how she coped with it. He died in 1882 in April, and I've called the poem after what the carpenter said. They lived in a little village in Kent. And the carpenter, really, he worked with a carpenter. Darwin had lots of bright ideas about how to find things out. He'd involve the children with them. He would ask the carpenter to make him things for bees or for mowing the grass to see how many grasses were in one particular square of it. So this is from the carpenter. "I made his coffin just the way he wanted, all rough." And so he was going to have a little village burial, but he got kidnapped by the state and put in Westminster Abbey. "They will bury him beside his brother, the village carpenter who made his instruments and boxes for his queer experiments, knows what he likes, simple and plain. An old friend will take the service. The publican at the George and Dragon prepares for crowds. But you're forgetting London. the Royal Society, the Dean of Westminster, a notorious free thinker in the Abbey, questions in Parliament, an Evening Standard campaign, a man who brought such honor to the English name should not lie in an obscure grave. This is Emma's voice. It gave us a pang not to have him rest quietly here. But we knew his gracious and grateful nature, would have wished to accept the acknowledgement. The carpenter complains, "I made it as he wanted it. No polish, nothing, just as it left the bench. His coffin was not wanted. The one they sent, you could see your face in it. Black horses, the blue, difficult, glossy manes. The hearse with her spray of white lilies. She watches him depart those 16 miles to London. She always prayed they would never part. She looked after him moment by moment. Now there's one more thing. Surely the God of love will not cast out a good man who searched so earnestly for truth. Memories, aging, their youth. It is almost worth being sick to be nursed by you. Oh, that I could remember more, but it was the same loving gratitude many times a day. Let's leave her in the drawing room at the piano. His tenderness seemed to increase. The last 12 years were happiest of all and most overflowing with affection. She's looking at the rain, at April grass. She lived through her desolation, the children will say, alone. This garden they made together, its life beyond the glass.
Well, I think we're coming nearer towards the end of 11 o'clock. So we thought if anybody had any questions, we could give them a go. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Yeah? Yeah. Stand at the microphone.
Hello. This is a question for both of you. What was the role of religion in the lives of Virginia Woolf and Charles Darwin? I mean, was Charles Darwin a believer? And after his theory of evolution, did that shake his faith or reaffirm it? And were Leonard and Virginia believers? So,
Well, I can quickly answer that they weren't religious and they were anti-war. So there we go.
I think Charles is a bit more complicated. Yes, Charles was more complicated. He came from a background in which conventional religion was taken for granted. Conventional Christianity was taken for granted. His family were all were either scientists or creators. I mean, Potters, the Wedgwoods, they were interested in science. And they were also democratic, very, very fiercely democratic. So they believed in the Reform Bill, the abolition of slavery. There was a whole liberal tradition of, but conventional religion was taken for granted. And then he was hopeless at school, and his father said he was going to be good for nothing and would make his family ashamed of him. So what do you do with a boy like that? You sent him to Cambridge to study to be a priest. So he did. He studied theology at Cambridge, but he was very fortunate that science, natural sciences, were then, they were rather like IT at the beginning of the 80s. There was a lot of discovery, a lot of buzz around it. And of course, he was naturally very good at it, and he met some wonderful minds at Cambridge who turned him into that direction. But he did naturally accept, as any person, any young man of his class would have done, an education, that Christianity was taken for granted. But during the 5 years of his voyage, he began to see that the idea that a flood had happened and God created the world, that this couldn't be literally the case, maybe metaphorically, but not literally. He saw the scientific truths written in the rock. And so after he came back, he thought very carefully and at times painfully. He began to disentangle the factual history of the creation of the world from the moral, ethical underpinning of Christianity, which he, of course, still believed. And so gradually that grew, and that was the position when he married Emma. And Emma was not a fanatical Christian believer, but she did believe very truthfully in the whole Bible. And when her sister Fanny died, she did sort of write in her Bible, hope for life after death makes this life possible. Hope of being together after death makes this life possible. So that was her position, and that was her position all through her life. So it was a difficult situation. But Charles never said he was atheist. He only ever said that he didn't know. And I think that's the only answer to your question. Any others? It does strike me we haven't talked about what this session was supposed to deliver, which is the burden of the legacy. Would you like to say anything about that?
I mean, we haven't directly talked about the aura and the shadow, but I hope that it's come across from both of us how passionate we are about them, and not just because they're our relatives, and not just because of them as writers and as a writer and a scientist writer, but sort of both. I mean, I grew up as a Woolf knowing about Virginia and Leonard, but then I came to her separately studying English at university. And then the two came together, and I suddenly became so happy and excited, and I feel the privilege of being related to Virginia and to the Woolfs. So it's not a burden. I mean, I think burden is not at all what it is. It's more, not even a responsibility. It's just a wonderful joy to me to be linked with Virginia and to read her work and to read her letters and her diaries, which I love, and things that my dad has, and the kitchen table that we eat our breakfast on, which Leonard and Virginia ate their breakfast on. You know, things like that are so special to me. So it's not a burden in any way, and I'm sure Ruth would probably feel similarly.
Yes. You know, they had a lot of children, so in my generation, I am one of 72 great-great-grandchildren of Charles and Emma. So in my daughter's generation, there are hundreds. So it's not unique to me at all. And of course, I'm not a scientist. I think if I were a scientist, it might feel different. But when I was working on him, I could just enjoy exploring. And somebody said, a biographer of Darwin said, everybody who works on him falls a little bit in love with him because he's got such a benign and anxious mind. I'll tell you one story to end up with. He always wanted to know the truth. And one night they had a friend to stay, and they were talking about the sense of the sublime, which is really an 18th century idea about where do you feel the sense of the sublime most? And he said that night by the fireside, I think I felt the sublime most when I was standing on the top of the Andes. So they all went to bed and put the fire out. But his friend wrote in his diary that about 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at his bedroom door. And he opened it, and there was Darwin with his nightcap on, saying, I fear I have misled you. I now think, I've been thinking about it all night, I now think that I felt the sense of the sublime most when I was in the forests of Brazil. Yes, I'm sure it was in the forests. So he just wanted to be absolutely absolutely sure. He was always sort of kind to people and anxious about their well-being. And it is, I feel like Emma, it's a privilege and a joy to be reading so much about such nice people. Okay, so I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much. Oh, no, sorry, there's one more question.
Just another question about legacy, like since you mentioned it. When you were growing up in school or college, did your friends know that you were descendants of Virginia Woolf or descendants of Charles Darwin, or your teachers, or were you?
I can't hear a word you're saying. Sorry.
Now?
Yes. Put your mouth in like that.
So again, another question about legacy. When you were growing up through school and college, like did your teachers and your friends know that you were descendants of Charles Darwin and Virginia Woolf, and were you treated any differently by them? And did people have certain expectations from you because of it?
Well, I mean, I'm a writer and Virginia was a writer, but we're in different fields that I would never even vaguely consider. I have written 2 novels, but I would never even put myself in that bracket. So I don't think there were expectations at all. It was 100 years ago, and what she wrote was exciting modernist fiction, very different experiment. I don't think there were expectations at all. No, not really. I don't know.
Well, when I was at school, of course, my name is not Darwin, so I'm lucky. I think I'm lucky in that respect. But I did write something. I had no idea how famous he was. He was just a scientist, and that was it. But I wrote something at school about him, because I was researching. I was 10 or something. And at the end I wrote, he was my great-great-grandfather. But I was much too shy to read that out at school. So I never realized really until I wrote this book. And then suddenly I had to go all over the world talking about it. So it seemed to me he was like Dr. Dolittle or somebody. He went around the world, he was interested in animals, and he thought that animals and people were the same sort of creature, and that's all I knew. Okay, thank you so much.
Hello. Hello. I thought you would answer this question by telling that whoever believes in the theory of Charles Darwin, I'm, by the way, a retired professor of medicine, whoever is walking on this earth today is carrying the legacy of Darwin. If you believe in that theory, that's a better way of saying than calling him father, grandfather, great-great. The legacy is not always genetic. If genetic is to be believed, then whatever Darwin said makes us all the children of Darwin in some way or the other on the entire globe.